Shalom and welcome to the Nucleus series on Lekutei Sichos, volume 15, Sicha Vayishlach 5, article B. It's an article on the second half of the Sicha, which is an entire concept for itself. The title is Jacob's Descent to Esau. So we explained in our previous article, titled A Place Called Botzra, that according to Rashi, Shem's prophecy to Rebekah concerning her unborn twins, Esau the elder and Jacob the younger, and the prophecy was, quote, and the elder will serve the younger, end quote, that it is unconditional, as well as it is for all times. Hence, the question, how could, in this week's Torah portion, I'm going to quote a couple of verses. 1, Jacob sent angels ahead of him to his brother Esau as gifts. 2, he tells the messengers, the angels, so shall you say to my master Esau, thus said your servant Jacob. Another verse, and he took from what came into his hand a gift for his brother Esau. And lastly, the verse says, and prostrated himself to the ground 7 times. Now, all of this is in direct contrast to Shem's prophecy, quote, and the elder will serve the younger. To the point that Rashi explains all of these verses that I just read with you is Jacob's direct intent was to show Esau, quote Rashi, it is not worthwhile for you to hate me on account of our father's blessings, which he blessed me, which was said, you shall be a master over your brothers. Why not? For that it was not fulfilled in me. Now, in the realm of the simple meaning of the verses and the story, this is not a question. Why? Because we see clearly that even concerning God's direct blessing to Jacob, in which God says, and you said, Jacob tells God that God said, and you said, I will surely do good with you, and I will make your seed as numerous as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of multitude. And nevertheless, Jacob says, I quote you Rashi, I fear lest I have become sullied with sin since the time that you promised me, and it will cause me to be delivered into Esau's hand. So if concerning a direct blessing from God to Jacob, Jacob is worried whether his sins sullied the situation, how much more so Jacob would fear as such concerning a prophecy said to his mother through Shem. Nevertheless, this answer is not smooth. For this prophecy, and so too Isaac's blessings of, quote, and you shall be a master to your brother, end quote, are both unconditional. And as we explained in that article, A Place Called Botzra, that even Isaac's blessing to Esau, that was, and it will be when you grieve. And Rashi explained when the Israelites will transgress the Torah, precisely what Jacob's present fear is, and you will cause to grieve about the blessing, you will have cause to grieve about the blessing that he took, you will break his yoke off your neck, meaning that Esau will only be able to break his actual work of servitude to Jacob. But nevertheless, Jacob remains, quote, be a master over your brother, end quote. Hence, how could Jacob have done all that contradicts the prophecy of Shem and the blessing of Isaac to the point of calling himself the slave and Esau his master? And while it is true that the Midrash states, quote, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, because you, meaning Jacob, humiliated yourself before Esau, end quote, the Midrash goes on to say that Jacob was therefore punished. But nevertheless, being that we are taught in the Medrash and in Tanya, and I quote, "The patriarchs are truly the divine chariot. They served as a vehicle for nothing but the divine will through all their years. Therefore, it is not possible to say that the patriarchs ever sinned. And even their actions, which are nicknamed as sin throughout the teachings, are not called sins in the simple meaning. Thus we find concerning this very instance of Jacob's action of humiliation of self towards Esau, that even though Jacob was punished for this, nevertheless, I'm going to quote to you a ruling from the Medrash Yalkut Shmoni. Quote, "From here we see that we flattered the wicked in this world for the sake of peace," end quote. Meaning that not only isn't it a sin, albeit for Jacob's level of righteousness and faith he was punished for this, but rather it is the source of a law of how we should behave the same. Hence, we need to understand why Jacob correctly and purposefully did so, according to the deeper teachings. In the teachings of Hasidus, it is explained that the reason why Esau was the firstborn by birth is because in their spiritual source, Esau is higher than Jacob. And only through Jacob's refining and rectifying Esau is there then an even greater light than that of the source of Esau shining into Jacob. Now, this is my own thought, not from the Sikh of the Rebbe, that maybe hence Esau ends up selling the firstbornhood to Jacob. Because at the end, Jacob did do the rectification and the elevation. Hence, he receives a light even higher than the source of Esau. Hence, Esau ends up selling him the firstborn rights. My thought. Let's go further with the Rebbe's teaching. With this, we can now understand why Jacob sent angels ahead of him. Now, mystically speaking, ahead of him means above Jacob's source, to the source of his brother Esau. And so shall you say to my master, to Esau, thus said your servant Jacob. Why? For Jacob was doing all of this on a spiritual level to the source of Esau, which is higher, my master, your servant, than the source of Jacob. And therefore, it is not an act of defiance or contradiction to the prophecy and blessing. Be a master over your brother. For on the contrary, through this is there then an even greater light than that of the source of Esau shining into Jacob, making Jacob the master over his brother. However, this is only the way it is concerning the spiritual source of Jacob and of Esau. While the Medrash stated, I quote from that Medrash that said that he was punished, because you, Jacob, humiliated yourself before Esau, end quote. That means down here. Therefore, we must explain how Jacob did this, not in his elevating himself spiritually, but also in his descent, humiliated yourself before Esau physically. The explanation is that in refining and rectifying, there are two formats. One is the format of shining. The refiner remains above and shines upon the refined. The second format is to enclothe. The refiner descends into the realm of the refined and clothes himself within the refined. Now, the first format is better for the refiner, that he remains above and does not need to descend into, I will quote to you words from Tanya, he who wrestles with a filthy person, and it goes on to say that it can then become soiled himself. While for the refined, the second way is better, because it isn't a light shining but upon him, which but breaks and pushes away the darkness, but rather It is in a way that in clothing, the change is happening within the refined, that the refined, as it is in its definitions and properties of opaqueness, itself becomes transformed into transparency to light. However, so there's two formats. However, Maimonides in the Laws of Hanukkah, and I quote, says, the entire Torah was given to bring about peace within the world. True peace is only when the enemy himself is transformed into a friend. Hence, it is all about making peace within the world. The Hebrew word for world is olam, and it is connected with the etymology of helem, concealment, opaqueness. Hence, the job is to take olam in its properties of helem and to transform it into transparency. Even deeper yet, not only to transform the olam when it is in its natural state of helem, but even when the olam is in a state of exile, which means that it is a double darkness, an opaqueness within an opaqueness. The ultimate purpose is to have our very prosecutors in exile, the anti-Semites who prosecute us, they themselves to acknowledge and ratify our self-sacrifice to God is one. So too, Jacob the refiner descended, even though Jacob will need a rectification. He was punished for this. But nevertheless, that's what Jacob does. He descended to Esau, the refiner, to transform Esau as he is down here, to the point that Esau ratified Jacob's blessing. As the verse continues with, my brother, let what you have remain yours. Rashi says, here he acknowledged, Esau acknowledged his, Jacob's, right to the blessings.